In PowerShell, there's actually 4 different ways of doing for each loops, or 3, depending on how you look at it. There's Foreach, 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 and of course, Foreach-Object. So in this video, I wanted to loop through how to use each of them, what the main differences are, and later on, I'll also show you that one of them is significantly better performing than the others, and 1 or 2 of them is significantly worse performing than the others. I'll also loop through use cases for each of the different ways, because which loop you should be using is not always a matter of personal preference. Sound good? Let's loop. If you're not familiar with for each or loops at all, here's a brief explanation. A loop is, in its basics, just do something over and over. Each time you do that something, that's called an iteration. And you can have different kinds of loops. There could be a loop for X amount of times, loop until something happens or changes, loop until I stop you, or as we'll be covering in this video, I have a bunch of stuff here, loop once for each one of them. And this is pretty much true for every scripting or programming language. They all have their ways of doing loops, but those basic types of loops is something that most languages have. All right, now to PowerShell and for each loops. Like I mentioned in the intro, you have 4 ways of doing for each loops in PowerShell, so let's introduce our contestants. You have the statement, the method, the alias, and the commandlet. Let's first look at the one that has been my favorite for years, the statement. A friend and colleague of mine likes to call this one the real for each loop. And that's partly because this way of doing for each loops is what most closely resembles how you do for each loops in other languages. If you're used to doing loops in, for example, PHP or C#, then this way of doing for each loops will look quite familiar. So let's take a look at how one uses the for each statement. All right, so I've prepared some lines of code here. And first, we need something to loop through. So let's just grab a few numbers and some services. So I'll just run that. And here we have the for each statement. It starts with a new line beginning with for each. Then you have a parenthesis where you start by declaring a variable, which you'll reference throughout your loop. And then you define what you are wanting to loop through. In this case, it will be a few numbers, meaning the numbers 1 through 1337. After that parenthesis, you have a curly bracket, and this just indicates that now the scripting begins. This is where you put your script block. And in my case here, I'll just grab the type of number. Say, if you look here, we reference the number variable that we define here. Then we simply run the getType method on that number. So if I now run this piece of code, that should return the type for that number. And as you can see, they are all integers. So that's a simple one. Let's grab another example. So next one here is for each service in services. So this first one is a variable we define, and the second one is just a reference to what you want to loop through. In our case now, that would be get service, or rather the results of get service. And then we do some things for each one of these. In this case, I've just used stop service. So as an example, another way you can do the for each statement is to first, again, begin with for each, define a variable that you want to use and reference in your script block. And now, instead of referencing a variable, we actually run some code to get the stuff that we want to loop through. In this case, I'll use getProcess to list all the processes on my computer, and then that's what we're going to loop through. So again, this would then stop each and every process found in the getProcess command. All right. Next up is the method, and this one is actually the newest one of our contestants. If my memory serves me correct, it was only added back in PowerShell version 4. And as you might guess, this way of doing for each loops is a method, meaning that the object, data, array, call it what you want, that you want to loop through might have this method built in. The method way of doing for each loops is, according to documentation and a lot of blog posts, faster than both the for each statement and the Foreach-Object commandlet. Later on in this video, I'll show you why that's, how should I put this, true. So let's check out the usage of the for each method. All right, so the same kind of preparations here. I first define what I want to loop through, and then I have an example here of using the method. You see, we reference a few numbers variable. This object contains a method called Foreach. So basically, I'm calling the method contained in the object a few numbers, and that method is called Foreach, and then I have parentheses, and then within these curly brackets here, that's my script block. So that would then be the same as the contents of the curly brackets from the statement example. And running this piece of code here should provide us with the exact same result as the example we used with the for each statement. So let's just try that, and we see that it's pretty much the same thing. What we get back is the type of each and every row or thing in that a few objects. Main difference that you might see here is that now we, instead of defining a variable that we reference in our script block, we simply use the $_. And this is exactly the same as we'll see later on when I show you the Foreach-Object commandlet. And by having to reference the $_ instead of some variable that we defined, you lose a little bit of readability, but that's a preference kind of thing. And this, the first example here is split across multiple lines for readability, but you can use it like this one here, where we spell it out on one line and the entire thing. Same thing goes, we reference our object, which contains the for each method, and then some parentheses and curly brackets, and then what we want to do with all the stuff in the services object. In this case, stopping each and every service. And again, here we can also run lines of code instead of referencing an object. So I could do get process here, and then reference the method for each. Same kind of thing. But the cool thing about the for each method is that it can actually also call or invoke methods of each and every line in the object. So for example, if I do it like this, I get process, meaning I'm grabbing all the processes on my computer, and for each of them, I'm referencing this method, which is in fact a method on each process. And this will effectively just kill each and every process on my computer. Same as the example before with the stop process. Now, one thing that is true for all kinds of for each loops is that you don't actually have to do something with the object you're referring to. So I just want to show an example here where I use the get process, and for each, meaning I call the method for each of the object, I will do write host hi, meaning that for each of every process found on my computer, this should now output hi in the terminal. So let's see how that would look. Pretty simple, huh? So with each and every one of these for each loops, you don't have to do something with the object, but you can do something based on the number of processes, for example. Right, that's the for each method. The next up is, actually, the last two of our contestants, the alias and the commandlet, I'll cover them at the same time. And that's just because the alias is, well, it's an alias for each object, meaning they are, in fact, the same. I must admit that I really don't see why the for each alias needs to be there in the first place, as it's only providing confusion and room for misunderstanding. If you put for each at the start of a line, it's a statement. If you put for each as a part of the pipeline, it's an alias. Easy, right? Anyway, the Foreach-Object commandlet is often the first for each loop you learn about when you're starting out your PowerShell journey. At least it was for me back in the days. And I was using this way of doing for each loops for years, up until I was introduced to the for each statement. The Foreach-Object commandlet and its alias is a very PowerShell way of doing things. So let's jump back into Visual Studio Code and some examples on it. By the way, all the code used in this video will be up on my GitHub, link down in the description. And while you're down there, hit that like button and subscribe button as well, as it helps out a ton, I hear. All right, so first up, the alias. As you can see here, we still have a few numbers, and then we pipe it, because we're doing the pipeline thing, to for each. And as you can see in Visual Studio Code, this actually gives me that yellow squiggly line because for each is an alias of Foreach-Object, and you should not use aliases, at least not in your scripts. But anyway, we have our object, we pipe it to for each, and then we have the curly brackets, which contains our little code snippet. So this little piece of code should produce the same result as we saw in the previous examples as well. So let's just run that. And we see that, well, all the numbers are still integers, so that's fine, I guess. You can also see that here we have the same kind of referencing as you saw with the for each method, meaning you only use the $_ to reference whatever you're looping through. Another way of doing it is, of course, on one line. You lose a bit of readability, but produce the same result. And likewise, you could loop through, for example, each service, do a for each and stop them all, again referencing with the $_. Or you could run some lines of code, pipe it on through to the for each, and then do something with it. In this case, I'll get all processes on my computer and then pipe it to the for each alias, and then use stop process on each one of them. And that's the alias. If we take a look at the commandlet, this is exactly the same as with the alias. You're just providing a bit more readability. So that's how you use the different kinds of for each loops. I would now like to do some measurements to see how they perform. As I mentioned in the intro, some of these methods or ways of doing for each loops perform differently than the others. So I have prepared some measurements here. So in this case, we need something a bit larger to loop through. So we will grab a lot of numbers. And then I have multiple lines here. This basically does the same kind of loops that we saw earlier. For example, grabbing the type of each and every number. But in order to find out just how long each and every run takes, I'll use the measure command. And then I'll pipe that on through to select object so that I only receive the total seconds. So I'll run each of this 5 times, and then you will see the results in the end. And through the magic of editing, I'll be back once this is all finished. Whoo! Finally done! And now that we have the results, we can see that the commandlet used around 45 seconds each run, while the alias, the alias you also used around 45 seconds, which is exactly as expected, seeing as they are the same. And let's see the method. They used around 33 seconds, so that's a major improvement. But if we check out the statement, the statement only used around 7 seconds. That means that the statement, at least in this kind of scenario, is the by far fastest way, or the best performing way of doing for each loops. All right, so now that you know how to use each way of doing for each loops and a little bit about the performance, I guess you want the answer to the big question, which one should I use? And I'm sad to say that the answer is, as with a lot of other things, it depends. Each way of doing for each loops has their use cases and advantages, except for the alias, of course, you should never use that. So let's consider the usage of each way, starting with the statement. The for each statement should pretty much be your go-to way of doing for each loops. I would recommend using this way unless there's some specific feature of one of the other ways of doing for each loops that you need. For example, if you need to use for each as part of the pipeline. The for each statement is simple. It provides a good level of readability, and since it loads everything in RAM before starting the first iteration, it is usually blazingly fast compared to the other ways of doing for each loops. The for each method, however, is more like a Swiss Army knife. Since it can be used to invoke the methods of each object, it also provides a lot of potential functionality. It can be a bit lackluster in the readability section, but definitely has good use cases. Performance-wise, the method is a bit slower than a statement, but that's only if you use it as a simple for each loop. If you, for example, use the for each method to loop through and call methods of the things you're looping through, that's where the for each method shines and where it actually outperforms all the other ways of doing for each loops. Let me show you what I mean. So down here in my measurement script, I have where the method shines. So in order for this example to really work, we need something that has a method built into it. So we need some processes. So let's start by starting up 100 notepads, like so. If we just wait a few minutes, they are opening up here on the other screen. All right, now I should have just about 100 notepad processes going. Now I could go ahead and kill them with a statement, meaning I use for each and then for each process in the get process with the name notepad. I should stop the process. So this is quite simple. I can just select this, run it, and all my 100 notepad processes is gone. But let's open them up again. All right, I have 100 notepad processes again. Now let's kill them with the method, because the get process has a method called for each, and each and every process has a method called kill. So that means I can select all this and just hit run on them, and they're gone. So that's a pretty easy way of using the for each method to call a method within that again. But just for fun, let's do the same with the commandlet. All right, I have another 100 processes of Notepad. The commandlet way of doing it would be to get process, name, Notepad, and then pipe it to Foreach-Object, and then stop process. So let's select that and run. And they're gone. So you can use all kinds of for each loops to actually kill all these processes. But let's do some new measurements now that we are using the for each method to call another method. So once again, fire up 100 notepads. Right, I have 100 notepads. Let's measure how long this takes with the statement. So I'll just select this and run it. Right, that took a total of 0.8 seconds, as you can see here. Now, let me just fire up 100 more, right? 100 notepad processes going. So let's use the for each method to kill them and measure how long that takes. That took a total of 0.03 seconds. Just for fun, we're going to do it the same with the commandlet. So let's fire up notepads again, 100 once. Right, I have 100 of them. Let's use the commandlet to kill them all. And that took 0.79 seconds, which is just about the same as we saw with the statement. But again, the for each method used, what was it, 0.03 seconds. That's a whole lot faster. So this is a kind of use case where the for each method really shines. And we've covered the statement and the method, so let's look at all the use cases and advantage of the alias. All right, that covered. Let's jump to the last of our contestants, the commandlet. Like I mentioned earlier, this was the first kind of for each loop I learned in PowerShell, and I used it for years. All until I was introduced to the statement way of doing for each loops, which made me switch completely because suddenly the commandlet was so slow. And the commandlet is slow compared to the statement, mainly because while the statement loads everything in RAM and runs it from there, the commandlet runs each and every iteration from the pipeline. That does have an advantage though if you're low on RAM. The commandlet does have its advantages and use cases though. It is more feature-packed than the statement, although not as much as the method. An example of this is that the Foreach-Object commandlet, it supports the use of begin, process, and end, which you might be familiar with if you've ever created advanced functions in PowerShell. which maybe is a topic I should cover. Let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see. So to sum up this section of the video, use the for each statement as your default for each loop. Use the for each method if you need advanced features like calling other methods. Never use the alias. Use the Foreach-Object commandlet if you're low on RAM or need advanced features like begin, process, and end. Also, the commandlet is useful if you need to use the pipeline. Like I mentioned, the for each statement will break the pipeline, while the commandlet will let you continue it. Now that you know all about for each loops, it's time to combine them with write progress so you can get those sweet progress bars. Learn all about that in this video. And with that, thanks for watching, like and subscribe to the channel, and yeah, see ya.